The whole county had known about Court Hale's situation, and the whole county had been wrong. Dora had known it too, which meant she had been wrong in the particular way of a woman who believes she is making a clear-eyed decision and is in fact making it in the dark. She had thought she saw the situation plainly. She had thought, here is a man who is losing ground, who is too proud to say so, who is going to lose the Hale place by spring if something does not change. She had thought, here is a man who will not ask for help. She had thought, and this was the part she would later have to reckon with, I can help him, and it will cost me less than it costs him. She had been 36 years old, a widow of 4 years, with 40 acres of her own that were paid off and a small steady income from the sewing work she took in from the town families. She was not wealthy. She was not comfortable by the standards of people who considered themselves comfortable, but she was solvent, and she was competent, and she had reached the point in her widowhood where the daily work of managing alone had become second nature, and what remained was the question of whether second nature was what she wanted the rest of her life to be. She had looked at Court Hale across the length of Benson County's opinion of him, and she had thought, I could keep this man. I have enough, and he is sinking, and a decent woman who has enough does not watch a good man sink if she can prevent it. She had not let herself examine what else she had thought, because the other things were not the kind of thing a practical woman examined when she was in the middle of making what she was calling a practical decision. They had married in October, quietly, at the county clerk's office, with 2 witnesses who were friends of hers and who had said nothing about it to her face and everything about it to each other, which she knew because one of them had the misfortune of being honest with her 3 weeks later when she asked directly. The county's opinion was that Dora Marsh had married a man who was going under and called it charity and dressed it up as marriage, and the county was not entirely unkind about this. They credited her with the generosity of it, but they thought she had paid too high a price for someone else's rescue. She had proposed it at his kitchen table, not her own. She had not wanted him to feel cornered in her house, with her 40 acres surrounding the conversation. She had come to him and laid out the terms plainly, her income and her means, his land and his labor, a legal arrangement that would give them both something neither could build alone. She had been specific. She had used the word arrangement and the word partnership and not the words rescue or pity, though those were the words underneath. Court had listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he had said he would understand if she needed time to be certain. She had said she was certain. He had looked at her for a long moment with the expression she could not read, and then he had said he was grateful, and she had said there was no need for gratitude, and they had both been wrong about what they were saying, but neither of them had known it yet. He was 42 years old, lean and weathered in the way of men who have worked outside for 20 years and have not much to show for it, and he had a quietness about him that she had always attributed to the burden of his situation. A man who is going under gets quiet, she had thought. The weight of it closes things off. She had met him at the county social in August, 3 months before she proposed to him, and she had been introduced to him by the Reverend's wife, who had said, in the particular careful voice that says everything in the way it says nothing, that Court Hale was a good man in a difficult time. She had watched him across the room for an hour after that, the worn coat, the boots that had been resoled rather than replaced, the way he ate what was offered with appreciation rather than appetite, the way a man eats when he is managing his hunger because there is not always enough. She had thought she was reading him correctly. She had gone home that evening and thought about what she had seen, and she had thought, here is a man who does not ask for help and will not get it unless someone finds a way to offer it that his pride can accept. She had thought about this for 3 months, the way she thought about most things, thoroughly and without hurrying. She had the 40 acres, clear. She had her sewing income. She had the experience of a woman who had managed a loan for 4 years and knew what it cost, and knew also that the cost was not only financial. She had thought, if the arrangement were structured correctly, it would not be rescue, it would be partnership. His land and her means, two working people building something that could survive. She had believed that she was being generous. She had believed she was clear-eyed. She had not believed she was in love with him, which was the one belief that had been accurate, though not for the reason she thought. She had been so certain she understood him. She found the ledger in November, 6 weeks into the marriage, while she was going through the house desk looking for the deed to the Hale property. She needed the deed because she was thinking about the spring planting and the field rotation and whether the east acreage could carry a second year of the same crop, and the deed would tell her the surveyed soil classifications if it was a good deed, which she suspected it was because Court did everything with a certain methodical care that she had noticed and not yet accounted for. The ledger was in the bottom drawer of the desk, under a folded survey map and 3 years of correspondence with the land office. She had not been looking for it. She pulled it out, meaning to set it aside and look for the deed beneath it. And then she looked at the cover, which said Hale Property Accounts in Court's careful hand, and she opened it. She almost closed it again immediately. It was his private accounting, and she had not been invited to look at it. She would have closed it, she thought afterward, if the first page had not already been open and the first column of figures already in her eye before she had made the decision about whether to look. She looked. She had expected to find the ledger of a man in trouble. She had expected arrears and shortfalls, and the particular accounting of someone who had been patching one hole by opening another, with hope in the left column and reality in the right and a growing distance between them. She had expected to find the evidence of what the county said, laid out in ink and numbers, the things she had married him to help address. What she found was nothing of the sort. The Hale ledger was the account of a man who understood money the way a good stockman understood cattle. Not as a thing to display, but as a thing to manage, to rotate, to let accrue in the right conditions, and move deliberately when the conditions changed. The columns were immaculate, cross-referenced in the manner of someone who had been keeping accounts for a long time and had never once needed to find an error after the fact, because the error had never been made. The handwriting was Court's, the same careful, unhurried hand she had seen on the survey map, and the figures were entered in a system she recognized after the first 3 pages as more sophisticated than anything she would have attributed to a man the county described as just getting by. She read the first page. Then the second. She sat down at the desk without deciding to sit. The Hale property was not 320 acres as Benson County believed. It was 410. The additional 90 acres were held in a separate parcel on the North Road, filed under his mother's maiden name in 1871 and never publicly spoken of, with 50 head of his cattle running on grass that no one in the county had thought to associate with him. The main place carried 62 head, not the 40 she had heard mentioned. The 40 were the ones visible from the road. The 62 were not a number the road revealed. The notes receivable, money owed to Court by other parties, were carefully documented and current, none of them in default. The total exceeded 2 years of her sewing income, and she made a fair wage for her sewing. She turned to the operating accounts. The year's costs were modest to the point of severity, almost nothing spent on his own appearance or the appearance of the property, which explained the tired fences and the barn that needed paint and the boots resoled rather than replaced. The money did not go to surfaces. The money went to land, to cattle, to the quiet quarterly reinvestments of a man building something that did not show from the road and was therefore not subject to the county's opinion of what he was worth. She had been subject to the county's opinion. She turned to the last completed entry and looked at the figure at the bottom of the column. It was not the figure of a man going under. She sat at the desk with the ledger in her lap and looked at the number, and then looked at the wall of his study and thought about what it meant. The county had been wrong. The man with the worn coat and the resoled boots and the hungry way of eating at the social in August had been, for the 11 years this ledger covered, doing the opposite of failing. He had been doing it quietly and with considerable discipline and without telling anyone, and the county had looked at the surface and drawn the natural conclusion. And she had looked at the same surface and drawn the same conclusion and had then organized her life around acting on it. It meant she had not married a man who needed keeping. She sat with this for a long time. The first thing she felt was something she would not have named as embarrassment, but was adjacent to it. The specific discomfort of a woman who has arranged her understanding of a situation with great care and found the arrangement built on air. She was not a woman who made errors of assessment lightly. She prided herself, quietly and without announcing it, on seeing things as they were. She had thought she was seeing Court Hale as he was. She had been seeing what the county showed her, and the county had been looking at the surface of a man who had very deliberately kept his surface unremarkable. She sat at the desk in the November light and turned the ledger in her hands and thought about the whole county's certainty and her own certainty and how they had locked together, each confirming the other, and how she had never once thought to look in the bottom drawer. He had said nothing to contradict the county's account. Not once. Not at the social in August, not in the 3 months she had been thinking about the arrangement. Not when she had sat across from him at his kitchen table and laid out her reasoning in her reasonable voice. He had said he was grateful. She had said there was no need for gratitude. He had looked at her with the expression she could not read. She thought about that expression now, and she thought she understood it. It was the expression of a man who knew why the woman across from him thought she was proposing and had decided not to correct it, for reasons he had not shared. He had known the whole of it, and he had sat there and said he was grateful and let her believe she was the one with something to give. She set the ledger on the desk and went to the kitchen window and looked out at the Hale property in the thin November light. The tired fences, the barn that needed paint. $40 of paint in a week's labor, she now understood. That he had chosen not to spend, not because he could not afford it, but because the appearance served him, kept people from looking too closely at an operation that was quietly not what they thought it was. She had looked closely. She had thought she was looking closely. She had been looking at the coat and the boots and the expression of a man managing his hunger, which she now understood had been a man doing nothing of the kind. The food at the county social, she thought. He ate with appreciation rather than appetite. She had read hunger into it. She might have been reading something else entirely. A man who had learned to take what was offered without excess, who had internalized a carefulness that had nothing to do with want. She had been reading a language she thought she knew into a man who was not speaking it. She thought about the 40 acres she had brought to the marriage, paid off and steady, her security and her pride. She had arranged the transaction in her mind with herself as the one contributing, the one with something to offer. She had been decent enough about it not to let herself feel the superiority of the position, but the position had been there, quietly, underneath the decency. She had not been the one with something to give. She had walked into this marriage with 40 acres and the conviction that she was the solution to a problem, and the problem had not existed, and he had let her come. She stood at the window for a long time. Then she thought the harder thought, the one she had been putting off. If she had not married him out of pity, and she had not, she could see that now, because pity required the other person to need something you had and he had not needed anything she had, then what had she married him for? She had proposed, she had arranged it, thought it through, presented it in her reasonable voice as a practical solution. She had been so certain it was practical. She had called it practical with such confidence that she had not once questioned whether practical was the whole of it. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the tired fences of a man who was not failing and thought about what practical had been covering for. He came in from the south pasture at midday, which was earlier than usual, and she heard him at the lean-to basin before she had finished deciding what she was going to say. She had not decided. She was not sure there was a right way to say it, which was an unusual position for a woman who was generally confident about the right way to say things. He came into the kitchen, and she was at the table with the ledger in front of her. He stopped. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. She looked back. Because she was not a woman who looked away from things she had done, even when she wished she had not done them. "I was looking for the deed," she said. "I wasn't." "I know," he said. He came to the table and pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the November light was the thin, flat light of a month that does not apologize for itself. "You let me think you were struggling," she said. He looked at the ledger. "I never said I was struggling. You never said you weren't." "No," he said. "I didn't." She held his eyes. He did not look away. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man constructing an answer. She had learned enough of him in 6 weeks to know the difference, but the quiet of a man deciding how far into a true thing he was willing to go. "Because I wanted to see what you'd say if you thought I had nothing," he said. "And because—" he stopped. She waited. "Because I knew why you were going to propose to me before you did," he said. "Benson County is not a large place, and people talk, and I knew what they were saying, and I knew you had heard it, and I knew you well enough by then to know what you'd do with that information." He looked at the table. "You would find a way to help that didn't require me to ask. Because you knew I wouldn't ask. You knew what I was doing," she said. Yes. She sat with that. A man who had known she was coming to propose a rescue and had sat at his kitchen table and listened and said he was grateful. A man who had known the whole county's opinion of him and had done nothing to correct it and nothing to refuse what the opinion had produced. "That wasn't honest," she said. "No," he said. "It wasn't." He said it without defense and without excuse, and the plainness of it stopped her next thought before it formed. "Why did you marry me?" she said. "If you didn't need to be rescued." He looked at her directly now, across the table and the ledger and the 6 weeks of a marriage they had both built on a misunderstanding, and the expression on his face was the one she had not been able to read in October. She could read it now. She had learned enough of his face in 6 weeks to have a working vocabulary for it, and she recognized what she was looking at. It was the expression of a man who had wanted something for a long time and had not known how to approach wanting it, and had taken the door that opened because it was the door that opened and not because it was built on anything he had arranged. He had not arranged it. She had arranged it. He had simply looked at the door and said yes. "I have been alone on this place for 9 years," he said. "My wife died in the 3rd year. I am not going to tell you I love you after 6 weeks of marriage, because that is not the kind of thing I say when I am not certain it is true, and I am not yet certain." He looked at the table and then at her. "But I will tell you that I sat at that kitchen table in October and listened to you propose a practical arrangement. And I said yes. And it was not because I needed your 40 acres. She was quiet. "My 40 acres, she said, are yours. They have always been yours. I have not thought of them as anything else, and I will not." She looked at the ledger. She looked at the man who had kept this ledger in the bottom drawer for 11 years and worn the same coat until it was tired and put his boots to the cobbler rather than the shop, and had sat at a county social in August, eating what was offered with appreciation, rather than appetite, not because he was hungry, but because waste was not a thing he practiced. She had read hunger into that. She had read an entire story into it, and the story had been wrong, and she had built 3 months of careful reasoning on top of the wrong story, and had then proposed marriage to him on the strength of it. "You dress like a man who can't afford a new coat," she said. "I have a new coat," he said. "I don't wear it for ranch work." She looked at him. "It seems a waste," he said, "to ruin a good coat on fence work." Something in her chest moved, not quite what she would have called laughter, but in the vicinity of it. She looked at the man across the table who had sat in the county's poor opinion for 9 years without troubling himself to correct it, and who had let a woman come to his kitchen table and propose to rescue him because the door had opened and he had wanted what was on the other side of it, and she thought, "I did not marry him out of pity." She had not known that until she found the ledger. She knew it now with the same clarity with which she knew most things she had thought through carefully enough. "The east acreage," she said. "I was going to ask you about the field rotation." He looked at her with the careful attention of a man who has said a difficult true thing and is watching to see what a capable woman does with it. "The east acreage is good for another year in the same crop," he said. "I was going to say so. I thought it might be. I wanted to see the deed to confirm the soil classification." He stood and went to the desk and came back with the deed, which she observed he had known exactly where it was, and he set it on the table beside the ledger and sat back down across from her. She opened the deed. The soil classification notes were in the surveyor's careful hand, the notation she had wanted. He was right about the east acreage. She had thought he would be. They went over the spring planting together, the deed and the ledger open on the same table, and she asked questions and he answered them, and she told him her thinking on the rotation, and he listened the way she had begun to notice he listened to everything, not waiting for her to finish so that he could speak, but actually receiving what she said and considering it, which was rarer than it should have been, and which she had noticed early and filed away and not yet accounted for. She closed the deed when they were done and set it beside the ledger and looked at both of them together, his 11 years of careful accounts, her 40 paid-off acres. Separate things on the same table. She thought, they do not need to be combined. They can simply occupy the same space, which was, she was coming to believe, what a good marriage required. Not the absorption of one into the other, but two capable people willing to work in the same direction. She brought the ledger back to the desk that evening and replaced it in the bottom drawer, under the survey map and the land office correspondence, in the same position she had found it. She smoothed the survey map over it and closed the drawer and stood there for a moment with her hand on the drawer pull. She had not been invited to look at the ledger. She had also found, now that she had looked, that she could not regret it. The truth was the truth whether she had been invited to it or not. And she was a woman who preferred to know the truth even when the truth required her to reconsider herself. She was reconsidering herself considerably. At supper she made no reference to the afternoon's conversation, and neither did he. And they ate the meal she had cooked and talked about the South Pasture water situation, which he thought would need attention before the hard freeze, and she agreed, and said she had a thought about the drainage on the low end that she wanted to show him tomorrow, and he said he would look at it. They talked about practical things in the way of two people who have said what needed to be said and are now returning to the work, which is where they both lived most comfortably. She noticed for the first time that he listened to her the way she listened to the ledger, with full attention, without interrupting, without filing her words away before she had finished saying them. He had always done this. She was only now naming it. He banked the stove before he went to bed, the same as every night, carefully, correctly. The iron settled right, and the damper closed at the right point to hold the heat through till morning. She heard it from the next room and thought about 11 years of careful columns and 50 head of cattle on the north parcel and a good coat kept out of the weather because it was a waste to ruin a good thing on work that did not require it. She lay in the dark and thought about what practical had been covering for and what it meant that she had proposed to a man she could not stop thinking about and called it practical, and whether the word had been a container or a costume. She thought about the county social in August and the way she had watched him across the room for an hour and told herself she was assessing the situation. She had not been assessing the situation. She had not known what she was doing. That was the truth of it. She had not known what she was doing when she watched him. And she had not known what she was doing when she spent 3 months arranging a way to approach him. And she had not known what she was doing when she sat at his kitchen table and proposed a practical arrangement in her reasonable voice. She had been, in each of these things, doing something she did not have a name for and had named wrongly to make it manageable. She had called it pity because pity was the closest word she had. She had not had the right word. She was beginning to understand what the right word was. He was a careful man. He kept his accounts in a bottom drawer and his good coat for occasions and his feelings until he was sure they were true. She was a practical woman who had spent 3 months arranging a marriage to a man she thought needed saving and had not once asked herself why she was the one who wanted to save him. They were, she thought in the dark, fairly well matched. The house settled around her in the way a house settles in November, the cold pressing at the walls and the stove's warmth holding it off. Outside, the November wind moved along the fence lines of a ranch that was not failing and had not been failing, and she thought, I did not know this man at all. She thought, I am going to enjoy finding out. She thought last, before she slept, I was not wrong that something needed saving. I was wrong about which one of us it was. She fell asleep with that thought, and she woke with it still there, settled and solid, the way true things settle when you have finally put them in the right place. Outside, the November light was coming in thin and flat through the curtains she had sewn herself in September, and the stove was holding its heat from last night's banking. And she lay there for a moment in the warmth of a house that belonged to a man she had not known she was marrying, and thought, I am going to be all right. She thought, we both are.